Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here with you for another beautiful Georgia morning. I feel very honored to be a part of this conference and to share in such great truths of the resurrection, the one God, and the human Messiah. It feels like such a family. It's really indescribable unless you're here joining in the great dialogue. You won't really understand. I feel like I've known all of you for my whole life, even though this is really only my second time to be here at this conference. And we've already heard such incredible presentations. These are going to be very hard acts for me to follow. And incredibly, I've only heard one thing that wasn't true this whole time. That's pretty amazing for a theological conference, right? And that's when Mr. Finnegan said that I write so much because I don't love you. Yeah, that could just not be further from the truth. It's precisely because I do love you. And as Sean reminded me, love doesn't hold back, right, Sean? But I am going to provide a little disclaimer this morning and tell you that what I'm going to be sharing is probably about 25% of the research that's actually in my paper. I'm going to try my very best to stay on the good side of the clock here, but I'll only be able to share just the tip of the iceberg on these matters today, and that's one of the reasons why my accompanying paper is so very long. So if you're interested in what you hear, just know that there is a lot more where that came from. This morning we're going to be opening the question of whether or not John, being inspired by the Holy Spirit, constructed his gospel to compete with Gnosticism. Now, this is a complicated topic, to say the least, but I think it's an important one. And you've all had your coffee, so I think you'll be just fine. But it is an important one because, as I argued in my recent book, the orthodox Christology is ultimately Gnostic Christology, repackaged and painted over with a Catholic veneer. So if John actually wrote against Gnostic Christology, then there could be implications for the orthodox reading. Well, I probably need my clicker here. So because this presentation entertains such a wide scope of ideas and information, I've seen fit to provide a little roadmap of our journey just so you know where we're headed with all this. So moving quickly, first we'll be giving an introduction to John and an overview of the history of John's scholarship relative to Gnosticism. Then I'll be introducing my own proposal about the fourth gospel. Next, we'll learn a little bit about Hermes and Hermeticism. And from there, I'll actually be comparing John's gospel to Hermeticism and looking at some parallels. Number 5, then I'll be establishing John's historical awareness of Hermeticism. We'll see if that was possible. Then I'll take some of the parallels, dig into them a little bit so we can see what exactly is John's true relationship with Hermetic Gnosticism. And finally, I'll be making some conclusions about John's Christology in light of this analysis and what it means for you and for your own reading of and future discussions of the Gospel of John. Okay, sound good to everyone? There's way too much to see on this journey, and if you've ever been trapped in a conversation with me, you'll know that I always have way too much to say and never enough time to say it. So we're just going to go ahead and get started here. If we can, with our clicker. Okay, the fourth gospel has fascinated Christians for centuries. John is certainly one of the most peculiar and most complex works of the New Testament. And over time, John has certainly demonstrated a unique ability to be employed in support of vastly divergent theologies. Everyone considers John a favorite text, which just proves their own Christology, right? And one thing is for certain. In the realm of Trinitarian versus Unitarian controversy, John has become the prime battleground. Yes, save for a few challenging texts in Paul, nearly all of orthodoxy's alleged proof texts come from John. Isn't that interesting? When considering the many mysterious sayings of Christ in John, the many mysterious sayings about Christ in John, the Unitarians have done very well in explaining what John really does mean. That John portrays Jesus as a real human being, that John's doctrine is Jewish and Unitarian at its core. But in my view, the conversation is still proven asymmetrical. We explained very well what John means about his peculiar language about Jesus, but we have perhaps not done as much work in explaining why John chooses to include this kind of language at all, while the synoptics don't. Yes, John speaks from his Jewish background, and even the most controversial sayings of Jesus have a basis which can be located elsewhere in the Bible or in proximate Jewish literature. But an important and I think much neglected question is, why does John say these kinds of things at all while the synoptics don't? In other words, our question is, why is the fourth gospel so different? We know that John is different from the synoptics. The style of discourses, the sequence, the range of Greek vocabulary, it's very different in many ways. But beyond all of these differences, there is very often said to be unique theological information present in John. Trinitarians have often argued that the reason why John is different is because John is bringing forth new information about the deity of Christ that the synoptics had not included or had not emphasized enough. Now, Unitarians have disagreed with this, of course. But again, we haven't been as keen on providing a reason why John does sound the way that it does. But hopefully we can just begin to open a door towards possibly discovering a reason. I will ultimately be arguing that John presents the same human Jesus of the synoptics, but for polemical and evangelistic reasons, he presents him in a unique way that confronts what is happening in John's environment at the end of the first century. In other words, John is different from the synoptics because he's dealing with issues that the synoptic writers weren't, namely the rise of early Gnosticism. Now, I suggest that if John is indeed the prime battleground for modern debates on Christology, then it will behoove us to understand the early Gnostic world that the gospel was born into, and the reasons why it was written, and why the Holy Spirit moved John to build his gospel in the unique and complex way that he did. And in doing this, I believe that we will ultimately see that John's Christological arguments present a truly human Jesus who does not literally pre-exist, and is not of one substance or one essence with God, in contrast to the views of John's theological opponents. And by the end of this presentation, I believe you may have an answer for some of your orthodox-leaning friends for why John is different from the synoptics, about why it includes this peculiar language about Jesus being from above and being one with the Father and so on. And you'll also be able to demonstrate that John's Jesus is deliberately not a spiritual being descended from on high. He is by no means a Gnostic mystery. He is instead the revealed Jewish Messiah, revealed to Israel in flesh and blood. And I believe this is very important. I think it's of supreme importance that we have the right Jesus, John's Jesus, don't you think? John certainly thought so. Okay, so we're going to begin by first considering the history of John's scholarship relative to Gnosticism. In the 2nd century, Christians were already divided on the Gospel of John. It was by no means universally accepted at first, and it caused quite a bit of controversy, as it still does today. The early disputes over it revolved around John's relationship with Gnosticism. Some Christians, like Irenaeus, said that John was written against the Gnostics. Others, like the ultra-conservative Baptist Sect, said that it was actually written by Gnostics. So what could cause such divergent opinions? Even early on, a very complex relationship with Gnostic thought was being detected. From the late 1800s to around the 1950s, the dominant opinion in scholarship was that there was indeed some kind of relationship between John and Gnosis, though opinions differed on the exact nature of that relationship. Some scholars said John was Gnostic, others anti-Gnostic, others Gnostic and anti-Gnostic at the same time, but certainly at this point, scholarship saw John in almost exclusively Hellenistic terms. But then, in 1947, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. The first century Jewish writings at Qumran suddenly demonstrated a surprising affinity with much of the language in John. And scholars began, scholars began to consider John within Judaism. They began to see little need to look to Gnosticism to explain the content of the fourth gospel. Thus, the paradigm shifted dramatically to the ends that today, most scholars see only a Jewish background for John. top John scholars can now be found claiming that Judaism can account for every feature of the fourth gospel. And so today, few give much thought, if any, to a relationship between John and Gnosis. But this is, in my view, a major overreaction. Many have sought to locate a single, simple solution to the background of John. However, as C.K. Barrett rightly said, it cannot be maintained that the background of the gospel is simple. The evidence is not sufficient to present a simple answer. In my opinion, the now dominant view of a simply Jewish background for John misses the larger picture of John's community circumstances at the end of the first century and wrongly downplays the significance of John's parallels with Gnostic thought, especially the Gnostic thought represented by what we call the Hermetica or the Hermetic literature. Most importantly, there are several features which I believe cannot be properly explained or accounted for by Judaism alone, such as John's teaching on rebirth and the gospel's presentation of the relationship between God, teacher, and disciple. And furthermore, we shouldn't ignore the fact that most scholars do see John's first epistle as anti-Gnostic, as reacting against some encroaching Gnostic, Docetic type of Christology. And most scholars do believe that John and 1 John are written about the same time, are written by the same author, they share the same community. So rather than take an isolationist view of the context of the Gospel of John and 1 John, it seems just as reasonable, given their parallels and the historical proximity, to conclude that the Gospel could have been written to address concerns posed by a range of troublemakers for John's community, which includes both Jews and Gnostics. So the solution which I am about to present is, I believe, more helpful than the isolationist reading and helps us to refocus on the anti-Gnostic motives in the fourth gospel and to ultimately recognize the human, non-Gnostic Jesus that is offered within it. And in considering these features, we may discover that modern John scholars on the Trinitarian side have missed completely the anti-Gnostic polemic in John because their own Jesus is so close, fundamentally, to the spiritual Jesus that John is arguing against. All right, so I'm going to begin sharing my proposal by first looking at what I believe John's goal was with his writing. I suggest that John's mission for his gospel is twofold. Number one, to present Jesus as a universal, salvific figure congenial to both educated Jews and Gentiles. And number two, to refute and compete with theological rivals and traditions which were threatening his community. John's method for accomplishing these goals is this: to construct an evangelistic, multi-front polemic for a mixed audience which will both directly confront the claims of his opponents and offer the Jewish Christian versions of religious and philosophical trends of the Hellenistic world. Now, by an evangelistic multi-front polemic, I mean that the Holy Spirit moved John to compose his narrative of Jesus' ministry with the intention of both evangelizing non-Christians as well as challenging several different opponents and ideas at the same time. And I believe that the format of a multi-front polemic suits John's mission very well. The Holy Spirit enabled John to summon the historical Jesus to defend himself against a range of challengers, to correct the record in the face of Christological speculation, and ultimately to present a Jesus and a Jewish Christianity which could stand on its own in a widening Hellenistic world. So who is the gospel written for? Who is John's community? The gospel's concern with the synagogue and the replacement of the temple with Jesus likely reveals John's community as probably a Jewish diaspora community, but one with a Gentile element. And it ultimately seems best to view John's gospel as reflecting a Jewish Christianity which was prepared to move beyond the confines of the synagogue, a choice perhaps made easier for them due to the evident expulsion of the Jewish Christians from the synagogue at that time. And this is not to suggest that John's community was willing to abandon or dilute its Jewish identity. Rather, for purposes of universal evangelism and perhaps even survival, It now welcomed the participation of the Hellenistic world in its new Christian brand of Judaism. However, John's community sought Gentile participation only within clearly defined boundaries. Those Hellenists who would join them on the side of belief in Jesus as the Messiah must be prepared to recognize the Jewish Jesus. It must be that Jesus of the apostolic preaching, 1 John 4:3. Jesus as Messiah is King of the whole world, King of the Jews and the Gentiles, yes, but he is first the King of Israel and the prophet like Moses. It is this standard that needed to be maintained by the converts, but likewise needed to be maintained by those already in John's community, or they must be prepared to secede, as evidently some of them did, as we read in 1 John. Thus, John's work in his gospel becomes that of evangelism as well as defense. Whoop. Back up there. Okay, so if John really is a multi-front polemic, then who is John writing against? I suggest that John's opponents can be broken down into three general categories. Number one, the Jews. Number two, the Baptist Sect. And three, Gnostics. So let's very briefly talk about the first category of opponents, the Jews. On the one hand, there were Jews who had probably expelled Jewish Christians like John from the synagogue, and they appear to have rejected Jesus in favor of more traditional mediators of the covenantal promises to Israel, like Moses and Abraham. In other words, they did not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. So John's polemics towards these Jews largely focused on establishing Jesus as the Messiah and demonstrating what Jesus as Messiah offers over Moses and Abraham. I think you can all think of the passages that I'm speaking about. Now note that there's no question of monotheism at stake in this gospel. Monotheism, surprisingly, contrary to what many of our Orthodox friends would like to have us believe about what John's intentions were, monotheism doesn't come up very much in John. Of course, one of the few places it does is in John 17:3, when Jesus says that the Father is the only one who is true God. The monotheism is taken as, it's very axiomatic, but monotheism is not the subject of debate in John. It's all about establishing Jesus as the Messiah. This is even the mission statement of the gospel, as we read at the end. And so these arguments are made in light of Jewish rejections of both Jesus and the Jewish Christians who believed in him. Okay, moving quickly, the second class of opponents here, the Baptist Sect. Pardon me. These are probably elements of John the Baptist community which were still causing problems for the Christians. Even into the 3rd century, we can still find church fathers complaining about members of the Baptist sect who were saying that John the Baptist was actually the Messiah. So this was evidently a persistent problem. And I see in the late 1st century that the Gospel of John is composed in part to deal with some of these issues. Think about it. In the Synoptics, John the Baptist is portrayed as someone who works alongside of Jesus. He even publicly baptizes Jesus. But in the Gospel of John, the baptism of Jesus is omitted completely. And the Gospel makes it clear that John was only a forerunner whose whole purpose was to point to Jesus. He even says, Jesus must increase, I must decrease. He even points his own followers to go after Jesus. He even says, I am not the Messiah. So it's been clear to many scholars that the Gospel is composed partly to deal with these persistent problems of the Baptist sect's claims about John and its competitions with John's Christian community. Now, the third class of opponents, the Gnosis-inclined individuals, apparently consisted of both early Christian Gnostics and pagan Hermetic Gnostics, or at least various syncretistic groups which were utilizing Christian and Hermetic concepts in literature. John's polemics against the Christian Gnostics, on the one hand, primarily involved issues related to Christology and the relationship of Jesus to the Jewish creator God. The polemics against the Hermeticists, or against those utilizing Hermetic literature, are mostly concerned with issues related to discipleship, salvation, and ultimately how and through whom one attains knowledge of and union with God. It's all about how do we get divine sonship? How do we become disciples and ultimately sons of God? Now, much has already been written on the Jewish background of John and his contest with the Jews over Jesus. But again, the focus of this presentation today is on this third group of opponents that I believe the gospel is targeting. And specifically, we're mostly going to be looking at the Hermetic opponents here, though there is a good deal of overlap between the Christian Gnostics and the pagan Hermeticists. They're really two sides of the same coin. All right? And ultimately, you may be wondering, why study John's relationship with Gnosticism and Hermeticism today? In 2005, in an analysis of John, scholar Pheam Perkins admitted that, quote, the appropriate paradigms that would account satisfactorily for the complexity of the relationships between John and Gnosticism has not yet been articulated. So there still seems room for further analysis. Indeed, up to this point, little work has been done in analyzing how a relationship between John and Gnosticism could actually support John's Jewish background and ultimately a Jewish Christian portrait of the human Jesus. Scholars like E.F. Scott, C.K. Barrett, C.H. Dodd, and many others have come very near to exposing John's relationship with Gnosticism. But in the end, I think these attempts have failed because in attempting to establish the positive side of John's Christology, they've relied overmuch on the very Hellenistic principles that John is competing with. Needless to say, many have neglected the power that the biblical Unitarian interpretation of John's Christology has to harmonize John with not only the human Jesus of the Synoptics, but with the monotheism of the Hebrew Bible. So, once more, just for clarity, our premise is this, that John is written in part to compete with an early Hermetic Gnosticism. By drawing parallels and providing the Jewish Christian versions of Gnostic fashions, John ultimately demonstrates his own faith's superiority. And in this, we see that John's human Jesus is not the spiritual being that both Gnosticism and orthodoxy need him to be. Now, at this point, you're probably all wondering, just what is Hermeticism? Many of you may have never heard of the prophet Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes thrice greatest. So I'll now provide a brief introduction to Hermes, and then we're going to look at both Christian Gnosticism and Hermeticism, and we're going to compare it to John, and we'll see if we can locate any kind of relationship between them. Sound good? Okay, so first, just who is Hermes? Pagan and Christian sources from late antiquity provide a colorful spectrum of answers to this question. To some, Hermes was a historical person, an ancient sage, seer, and prophet. To some, he was the author of hundreds of mystical books concerning astrology and alchemy and magic. To some, he was even a man become God. In the early centuries, Hermes even had his admirers among the church fathers, which may or may not surprise the people in this room. 4th century church fathers like Augustine and Lucius Lactantius believed that Hermes was a real historical person. They held him to have been an ancient contemporary with Moses, who passed down his wisdom to the Greek sages, and a man who really wrote the books of what we call the Hermetic corpus. However, scholars today do not believe this. They instead consider Hermes Trismegistus to be a composite god, a figure who resulted from Greco-Egyptian syncretism. He's a combination of the Egyptian deity Thoth and the Greek deity Hermes. And these gods were very easily identified as both were gods of wisdom who conveyed divine messages to humankind, who were shepherds for mankind. And it may also be important to note that Hermes was already closely associated with the Greek concept of the Logos. In fact, he embodied the Logos of a monotheistic, ultimate God. Hermes was God's divine word and reason made manifest to men. That may or may not sound familiar to you. And Hermes Trismegistus ultimately became the central figure of a religion developing, from what we can see, perhaps even 100 years before the Common Era, known as Hermeticism. But Hermeticism really represents only one branch of a larger philosophical and religious trend blossoming at the turn of the millennium, coming out of centers like Alexandria and Ephesus, and ultimately taking up a stronghold in Rome, and that is Gnosticism. But this is a word that has been thrown about by so many people. It's been used so often by me just this morning. So what is Gnosticism? Well, today, the use of the word Gnosticism is still hotly debated. That's one of the reasons it's so confusing when you read some of these scholarly works. Now, while many have used Gnosticism to describe a particular Christian heresy, it may also, in general, be used to describe a fluid category of spiritual traditions, both pagan and Christian, developing around the first century. This mystical movement emphasized the acquisition of gnosis, or secret and intimate knowledge of the divine, in order to achieve salvation. One was very often to come to the knowledge of one's own divinity, to realize that you are God. And once you came to this knowledge, it would enable a grand escape from the clutches of the material world. And you would fly off to be reunited and reassimilated to God, to rejoin the God that you are. Often these traditions looked to a central figure who imparted this divine knowledge to the Gnostic through secret teaching. But really, these Gnostic groups ultimately represent a melting pot of world faiths, although all largely cast in the shadow of Platonic philosophy. So let's very quickly talk about the Christian form of Gnosticism first, before we get back to the Hermetic tradition. Christian Gnosticism, of course, looked to Christ as its central figure, who imparted the secret gnosis. In fact, there came to be an emphasis in Christian Gnostic circles in the secret teachings of Jesus, which were allegedly passed down through a particular apostle to an inner circle. And by the 2nd century, we find a variety of books are beginning to be written down purporting to contain Jesus' secret teaching. And these Christian Gnostics had perhaps found some justification for this in the synoptic passages like Luke 8:10 and Matthew 13:11, in which Jesus is speaking only to his inner circle of disciples. So it's possible that the Gospel of John may move to curb Gnostic claims about Jesus' teaching in secret. In John 18:20, Jesus says, quote, "I have spoken openly to the world, and I spoke nothing in secret." Now, I won't go into detail regarding what Christian Gnostics believe Jesus' secret teachings contained. That would take a couple of presentations. But I have included on the screen several of the mystical Christologies, which the different sects were responsible for, many of which bear striking affinities to orthodox Trinitarian Christology today. And I've written in great detail about the connections between Gnostic Christology and modern Trinitarian Christology. In my recent book, as I mentioned, I argue that fundamentally the dual nature Jesus is the Gnostic dual nature Jesus is the dual nature Jesus of the Orthodox councils. And I'll have to refer you to my book for that, since today our great focus here is on Hermeticism. But ultimately, the early Christian Gnostics had associated the historical man Jesus with a spiritual being. They had looked to identify him as a divine entity, even the highest God, who had come down from heaven to impart gnosis to the world. While some later systems, Gnostic systems, did teach that Jesus had a body or a divine sort of body, most of the earliest Christian Gnostic circles equivocated on that humanity. This divine Jesus usually did not experience a real human life. He was docetic, or he only appeared to be human. So in response, I find that the Gospel of John works to identify Jesus as a real human being, truly sharing in the human condition. John's Jesus eats, he drinks, he bleeds, he dies on the cross. His real flesh and blood is touched by his disciples even after his resurrection. And the disciples were made to recognize the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Many have realized that the final chapter in John was a later addition. You know, the one in which the resurrected Jesus decides that he's going to cook some food and eat it. It's kind of curious, right? Why did we add this chapter on here in which the resurrected Jesus is eating? He even goes so far as to share that same food with his disciples, probably just so you understand that it's real food. And why? Well, it's possible that he's reacting to something in his environment. Because by the 2nd century, we find a variety of Christian Gnostic theories about Jesus not requiring food, or not defecating or being sustained by some different sort of heavenly food that was different than the disciples' food. And I think this additional later chapter of John is written to confront early speculation of this kind. Now, early Gnostics, holding Christ to be spiritual and an incorruptible being, they often look to evade the destruction of the cross to some degree, many times going so far as to even cast the crucifixion as an illusion. But the figure which the fourth gospel calls the beloved disciple, he provides eyewitness accounts saying that he personally saw the water and the blood pour from the dead body of Jesus. The crucifixion was no illusion. We may in fact find John reacting against another Gnostic theory about the Savior's cross, in which another man, Simon of Cyrene, was actually crucified in Jesus' place. Now in the Synoptics, we do read that Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus' cross for him. That's Mark 15 and Matthew 27. But in John, Simon of Cyrene is omitted completely. And John makes it all too clear in John 19:17, where we read that Jesus, quote, carried his own cross by himself. This emphasis may have served to disown an early version of a Gnostic replacement theory. Now, recognizing another technique of John's will prove increasingly helpful in establishing the fourth gospel's polemic and ultimately in better recognizing his Gnostic targets, and that's the misunderstanding motif. Misunderstanding Jesus is in fact a major and pervasive theme of the fourth gospel. And I've found, as I've counted through the gospel, that Jesus' audience misinterprets or doesn't recognize him properly in at least 15 out of the 21 chapters. So that's a pretty dominant theme. And interestingly, we find that most of the passages which our Orthodox friends are citing for support of pre-existence are actually connected to this misunderstanding motif and are often directly taken from the mouths of Jesus' mistaken opponents. In my own studies, I found that it's possible that John could have selected the historical sayings of Jesus' enemies, which mirrored or paralleled what John's Gnostic opponents were teaching about Jesus, and cast them as misunderstandings. The Holy Spirit could have enabled John to recall the sayings of his enemies and the sayings of Jesus, which the Synoptics had had no need of, in order to assist John in his community conflict. Regardless, as other scholars have proposed, it is possible that we detect a multi-level history in John. And one more thing here on this slide, as I briefly mentioned earlier, in the records of the early church fathers, we do find the opinion that John's gospel was indeed written to combat Gnostic thought. The 2nd century Christian Irenaeus says that John's gospel was specifically composed against the Gnostic Cerinthus. Now, whether it was really Cerinthus or not, we have perhaps here the basis for the very, very early belief that John was written with refutation of Gnostic ideas in mind. Okay, so that's very briefly what the Christians were doing with Gnosis, and a little on how John was probably responding to them. But parallel to the Christian form of Gnosticism existed the pagan form of Gnosticism, Hermeticism. When you hear someone speaking about pagan Gnosticism, they're probably referring to the Hermetic tradition. Now, the Hermetic tradition bears a close affinity to its Christian counterpart. Both traditions believe that man contained a spark of the divine, that man is by nature God, and that personal knowledge of God and of one's own divinity was possible for humankind. And that human destiny was ultimately to escape this material world and to be rejoined to God. So they do share those things in common. Of course, the biggest difference is that Hermeticism looks to Hermes Trismegistus for this gnosis. Hermeticism has no place for Jesus. In fact, we know that Hermeticism was chronologically earlier in terms of origins than Christian Gnosticism. The Hermetic writings, there are a lot of them, they cover a broad range of topics from theology, philosophy, astrology, alchemy, spellmaking. The religion had an emphasis as well on the close relationship between the teacher and the disciple. The teacher himself, the Hermetic teacher, acted as an incarnation of the Hermes Logos, who was guiding and shepherding his students into gnosis of God and ultimately to reunion with God. And we'll get into all that shortly as we continue talking about Hermeticism. But now, what we've all been waiting for, It's finally time to look at some parallels between John and the Hermetic writings. Out of all of the Hermetic writings, the Gospel of John shows the most affinity to the ideas presented in the 1st and 13th tractates of what we call the Corpus Hermeticum, known as Poimandres and On Rebirth, respectively. So I want to begin by just first taking a look at Poimandres as a sort of introduction to this literature. Now, keep in mind, this is a pagan document from the 1st century. Okay? Nothing to do with Christianity at all. Pagan document from the 1st century. But listen to this language. Okay? In Poimandres, a divine being appears to a disciple. And he says, I am the nous, the mind, the first God, and the luminous word, logos, that issued from the mind is the Son of God. Did you notice that? Here we have a monotheistic God, one they actually called God the Father, believe it or not. And God the Father issued forth a logos, and the logos is his Son. Then we read this, that suddenly the logos of God was united with the mind of the demiurge, for the logos was of one substance, homoousios, with the mind. Do you hear the language of Nicaea there? The one God the Father is homoousios with the logos his Son. Do you think that's an accident? That would be a whole other presentation. Maybe we'll get into that another time. The final hymn, we read this. And so with all my soul and strength I praise God the Father. Holy is God the Father of all, who precedes all beginnings. You are holy, who by your logos made all things that are. Okay, so first of all, this sounds eerily Christian, even Trinitarian. And that's precisely why Christians like Lactantius and Augustine identified Hermes as an ancient prophet of their 4th century Nicene Christianity. But as I said, that's a presentation for another time. But second of all, this sounds a little bit like the Gospel of John. In fact, there are many uncanny parallels between the Gospel of John and Poimandres. The themes of light, life, logos, truth, fullness, these are prevalent in both, along with the names shepherd, vine, door, doorkeeper. I went through both books and I counted, and references to light occur 19 times in Poimandres, with 9 pairings of light and life. Does that sound familiar to you? Light and life? Where have we heard that? Well, John likewise speaks of light 23 times and pairs it with life at least twice. As scholar Arthur Samuel Peake concluded, the combination of logos, life, and light occurs in a way not paralleled elsewhere. And it's true. As we begin to take a closer look, we start to see a wide variety of common themes between the two works. For example, the name Poimandres, according to scholars, probably means something like man-shepherd or the shepherd of men. Sound familiar? Because in both Poimandres and in John, we have a good shepherd, a teacher sent from God the Father, sent down from heaven, safeguarding his disciples through a world of light and darkness. And this heavenly guide brings God's teaching in order for men to reject, quote, the world, and to be ultimately rejoined to God as his children, as his sons. So, eerily similar to John, isn't it? And I do want to take a few more minutes to build my case with you even further and look at some more thematic parallels between John and the Hermetica. And I'm warning you, we're going to be going through these way too quickly in the interest of time, but you can consult all of these in my paper and in much better detail. Okay? So, pardon me. Whoops. Our first theme is discipleship. Very quickly. In both the Gospel of John and in the Hermetic works, we find the idea that the disciple will not stay in darkness, that the disciple's fruit will not pass away, that the disciple's sorrow will be replaced with joy, that it's the will of God that sustains the disciple's life. There is the theme of the cleansing and the purification of the disciple by the teacher. The disciples personally and mystically perceive the teacher beyond the normal senses. The world will not see me, but you will see me. This is an interesting parallel. There's a double-sided recognition. So there is one Hermetic text in which the disciple says to Hermes, I know you, Hermes, and you know me. I am you, and you are me. Of course, in John, we hear Jesus say, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. So maybe a little competition there. I'm not sure. Ultimately, it's God who causes remembrance in the disciples. Remember, the Gnostic is trying to realize or to remember something about their divine nature that they forgot. So it's God's divine action that is causing a remembrance of some truth. Also, in John, we see that it's God, the Holy Spirit, will bring to remembrance everything that Jesus has taught. The teacher ultimately prays to God the Father on behalf of the disciples. And this is a very interesting one. It's ultimately the disciples' righteous living that wins, number 1, the Father's love, number 2, revelation, and number 3, salvation. The teachers and disciples both bear witness to the truth. So does John the Baptist and John. The disciples are to be disconnected from the world, as we talked about, and ultimately disciples gain personal knowledge of God. The next family of themes here regarding the spiritual teacher or the guide himself. The teacher is the shepherd for the sheep. The teacher is also the doorkeeper. He uses that same language there, the doorkeeper. And in the teacher, we have the joint arrival of truth and life. The teacher speaks in riddles, as we've talked about, a very common theme in John. The teacher gives the words of water and life. Or as it says in Poimandres, Hermes has the words of deathless water. Salvation comes through receiving teachings and sayings, and the world is ultimately saved through this spiritual guide. And here's a really fun one here, the prolificity of the teacher. So there's a tradition in which Hermes was the author of 36,525 books. And in other words, one book a day for 100 years. And this is to communicate the innumerable works and deeds of Hermes, right? Well, you remember in the end of John, when it says all of the cosmos could not contain all of the books that tell us everything Jesus said and did. Maybe a little competition there. Not sure. All right. Now, dualism, we're going to skip over this one because we're going to talk more about that later. Let's go to the next one. God and man. We'll skip over some of these. But down here, this one is great. God the Father loves man in the Hermetic literature, or the archetypal man, the primal man, this heavenly man. God the Father loves him, and he ultimately consigns authority over all men in the cosmos to him. Of course, Jesus says, no, it's the Son of Man. The Son of Man has been given authority over all men in the cosmos. And here's the most important one, I think. Going to the Father. Remember, as a Hermetic Gnostic, you are supposed to awaken to your true self, that you are God, and this ultimately enables you to do what? To return to the Father. Going back to the Father. Trinitarians say that a lot, going back to the Father, right? So this is a very prominent theme in John, but it's not in the Synoptics. Have you noticed that? Going to the Father is not in the Synoptics. I haven't found it. Maybe you have. But it is in John. It's all about going to the Father, and how do you do it? It's through Jesus, not any other way. All right, next one. Whoop. All right, this is a very interesting set of parallels, and you can read a lot more about this in my paper if you're brave enough. And I believe this is one parallel which cannot adequately be accounted for by Judaism alone, despite what many moderns say. Nothing in the Judaism of the period comes close to matching the staggering parallels between John chapter 3 and its presentation of the doctrine of rebirth and the Hermetic book on rebirth. Nothing comes even close. For example, in both John and on rebirth, rebirth is cast as a spiritual mystery. Have you noticed? And it's presented within a dialectical framework containing many uncanny similarities. We're just going to breeze through them really quick. In both dialogues, both involve a teacher engaging in private dialogue with a disciple. Number 2, both dialogues begin with the disciple seeking the teacher out after hearing his previous teachings. Number 3, both involve the teacher offering his disciple the riddle that one cannot be saved without rebirth. Hermes tells his disciple this in almost the same language. He says, no one can be saved before rebirth. And Jesus tells Nicodemus, no one can enter the kingdom unless he is born again. Number 4, both involve the disciple then becoming bewildered and asking how the process of rebirth is to be accomplished. Number 5, both involve the disciple specifically questioning the teacher about the womb of rebirth. They both mention that word, the womb. And both involve the teacher then reaffirming the mysterious nature of rebirth and its accomplishment only by divine action. And both teachers refer to the blowing of wind and how it's not seen by the eyes. And ultimately, both dialogues connect knowledge of the divine to rebirth. And there are half dozen other similarities between the presentation of the doctrine that is very similar that we don't have time for. But ultimately, my argument is this. While Philo the Jew may say that Moses experienced some kind of second rebirth when he went up to Sinai, and while later rabbinical commentaries may show some loose concept along these lines, it is abundantly clear that no Jewish source from the period can match the quality and the concentration of the Johannine parallels with the Hermetic teaching about rebirth. So, in just reviewing these few parallels, and this is just a few of them, needless to say, I think there is good grounds to suspect that there is some kind of relationship between the Gospel of John and Hermeticism. The question now is, of course, could John really have been aware of Hermeticism? Now, I will say that while many of in fact, most of the Hermetic writings that we currently have in our possession date from around the 2nd century, in other words, after most currently popular dates for John, some, as I mentioned, like Poimandres, date to the 1st century. And experts on the Hermetic literature today now date Poimandres to the 1st century at the latest. On top of that, I think we should point out that the written Hermetic text that we have need not have been in existence in John's time in order for the ideas behind them to have been in circulation. We must keep in mind that the writing down of a tradition by no means dates that tradition. A religion is always lived and experienced before it is ever written down. For example, the teachings of Jesus circulated for decades before the Synoptic Gospels were written down. And many scholars think that Mark, for example, was written around between 50 and 70, but that Mark reflects an older tradition in teaching, as well as drawing from perhaps earlier gospel documents like the hypothetical Q source. So I argue that an early Hermetic tradition could have easily been known by John in the same way, and that the Hermetic works that we currently have that are commonly dated to the 2nd century or older could reflect a slightly older tradition. Remember, most scholars are dating John between 90 and 110 these days, right? So how far do we have to go back? Not very far. And here are a few scholarly considerations of this idea. Smalley writes that, quote, "It is possible for the ideas which were eventually incorporated in the written form of the Hermetica to have been in circulation in the Mediterranean world at a much earlier date and to have influenced the writing of the 4th Gospel." Barrett writes that the Hermetica are incorporating matter almost certainly early enough to have been contemporary with John. And Peake writes that there is no reason whatever why a Palestinian who had lived in Asia should have been unfamiliar with Hermetic speculations. So if we agree with scholars that John could have been aware of Hermeticism, what is the real nature of the Gospel's relationship to it? Now, I'll save you time and tell you that scholars do not believe that Hermeticism was influenced by Christianity. But they also hold that John did not really borrow theologically from Hermeticism. None of us would think that. They often do suppose that John and Hermeticism only emerged out of the same environment of thought. Thus, they often cast the parallels as accidental. But in my view, the parallels are not accidental. They are deliberate attempts to reframe the Jewish gospel in Hellenistic and even nearly Gnostic forms in order to evangelize the Hellenistic world and to compete with it. The Hellenistic world is searching for truth, and John offers them that truth that his Jewish Christianity has in a way they're expecting to find it. This is basic evangelism, really. Paul said, "Oh, I see that you worship an unknown God. Let me tell you about him." But I think that most commentators are fundamentally correct in saying that John is not truly indebted to Hermeticism for his doctrine. As E.F. Scott rightly said, quote, "We must distinguish the essence of John's thought from the form in which he embodied it." And I think that's right. John is aware of Hermeticism, but his own doctrine is not enabled by it. John's doctrine is Jewish. It's Jewish. It's Unitarian. It's especially motivated by Jewish wisdom literature and the Hebraic law of agency. But he emphasizes particular elements of his Christian Judaism and couches them in such a way that draws deliberate parallels with the Hermetic thought in order to compete with it. But now I just want to take just a couple of the most important parallels and demonstrate my argument that John is in fact providing the Jewish Christian versions of these ideas. And in this, I think, we will finally begin to see the real human Jesus shine through. All right, dualism. In Hermeticism, as in all Gnostic movements, there is a major emphasis on dualism. There is a higher world of light and spirit and a lower world of darkness and matter. Thus, in Hermeticism, the world is split between light and dark, above and below. And this is a true dualism, what scholars call a true dualism or an ontological dualism. And what that means is that mankind is ontologically linked to the principles of above and below. Now, parallel to this, there is also a dualism in John. In John, we also see the world is split between light and darkness, above and below. But here, scholars have revealed today that this is an ethical dualism in John. Not an ontological dualism, an ethical dualism. The dualism in John is set within the created world. People are not ontologically connected to the dualistic principles of above and below. So we see a parallel between Hermes and John, but John's dualism doesn't come from Hermes, and we can actually see a similar ethical dualism of light and darkness in other Palestinian Jewish writings from the first century. So scholars like Peter Borgen have agreed that John's background is formed by the Jewish writings, but that John nevertheless uses language which is typical in the Hermetic literature. And this ultimately draws out an ethical or a moral dualism in contrast to an ontological or Gnostic one. Okay, and as you may be wondering, why might this be interesting from a biblical Unitarian perspective? How does this help us in our debates about Jesus in John? Well, as Borgen also concludes, Jesus' claim that he is from above while his listeners are from below echoes Gnostic dualism between the lower psychic world and the upper pneumatic world. However, this Gnostic dualism is of a cosmic nature, while the Johannine dualism is basically ethical despite its spatial framework. So when John speaks about coming from above or below, we are not to think of this spatially or literally or ontologically. John is instead presenting an ethical dualism. So John's Jesus is not ontologically linked to the upper spiritual world. He does not mean that he has literally come down from heaven. And if John's dualism is ethical for the disciples and other human beings, then it is ethical for Jesus. John describes himself, the disciples, their opponents, in the same spatial directional language that it uses for Jesus. It places them alongside of him within the same dualistic spatial framework and often in the very same breath. You could compare the following text and ultimately see that the same dualistic language of above and below that is used of both Jesus, his disciples, and his audience. They are all from above, from heaven, from God, not of this world, not from the earth. Those who seek to establish a Christology of ontological pre-existence or deity cannot do so by merely appealing to this language. And Trinitarian scholars who have correctly recognized that John's dualism is ethical and not ontological have ultimately failed to follow the Christological implications. Okay, one more important parallel. There is the notion of oneness or the triunity of the teacher God and the disciples. So in the Hermetic tradition, there is an emphasis on oneness. God the Father, Hermes the teacher, and the disciples are all one. Remember, the knowledge that the Gnostic teacher brings is that each of us share the same divine essence. That we are each God. We're one with each other. We're one with Hermes, the teacher, and we're ultimately one with God. And our destiny is ultimately to truly rejoin and be reassimilated to God. So the oneness of Hermeticism is a oneness of essence or of nature. The oneness is ontological. Okay, and alongside of this in John, there's also a oneness, right? God the Father, Jesus the teacher, and the disciples are all one. But in John, we've already seen how he is not concerned with metaphysical categories, but with ethical categories. Thus in John, they are all of one mind, of one purpose. They are united in fellowship and in the eschatological mission. So, like the dualism, the oneness in John is not ontological, but ethical. And we know that the oneness in John is not ontological because in John 17:21, Jesus says that his disciples are to be one with him just as he is one with the Father. May we all be one together, Christ and the Father and the disciples, and so on. Whatever the oneness between the Father and the Son, the disciples share in it. So, if the Son shares a nature or a substance with God, then so do the disciples. And this would be the precise view of Hermeticism. Of course, it is not the view of John. So we see what John has done here once again. He has taken the metaphysical categories of his opponents and turned them on their head in order to present something Johannine, something Jewish Christian. So if we string all of these things together, what we have in John is a human Jesus set within an ethical dualism who doesn't literally come down from heaven despite the spatial language and who isn't ontologically one with God and his disciples. Thus, in John, we have a rejection of the Gnostic Jesus, and we also have a rejection of the orthodox reading of John's Christology. Now, there are a host of other parallels. We could go on and on speaking about these, but I'm just going to mention one more as we're running out of time. We could consider the Gospel's exclusive use of the title Son of God. This is something I've just begun to think about. We know in the Synoptics Jesus is called the Son of God, right? We notice in John he is cast as the only Son of God. It's only in John. Isn't that interesting? In fact, in John, Jesus is the only Son of God, and if you want to also become a Son of God, there's a certain way you have to do it. I found in 2 different places in the Gospel, it actually gives you instructions on how you can also become a Son of God like Jesus. You must receive Jesus, the Logos. Now, who is Jesus, the Logos? Well, he's the messenger sent from God the Father. And this may stand to compete with Hermeticism, in which one already is a Son of God by nature. You simply must realize it. You must be awakened to that fact after receiving the teachings of Hermes the Logos, who is the messenger from God the Father. Again, for John, it's all about through whom one gets knowledge of God, through whom one can go to the Father, through whom one can acquire divine sonship. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one goes to the Father but through me, not through the divine shepherds of Hermeticism, not through any of these mystical visionaries. Jesus says, no one has ascended into heaven and gotten this knowledge but me. Yes, the Gnostics were claiming to have ascended into heaven to get that gnosis. They spiritually meditated to get there. And Jesus says, no one has done this except for me. I am the good shepherd. Forget the other shepherds of men that you've heard about. Forget Poimandres. I am the good shepherd, and all who came before me were robbers. It's all about how we get to the Father. It is through Jesus, through John's Jesus, through the Jewish Jesus. To conclude, in the 4th Gospel, we have just begun to discover a layered polemical narrative which seeks to establish Jesus and John's Jewish Christianity in a widening Hellenistic world. John competes with Jews on the one hand, and with Christian Gnostic and Hermetic trends on the other, both of which were encroaching on his community and threatening to both siphon its members away and to abrogate its message. And in our analysis of John's method, we've encountered a Jesus who contrasts sharply with the Gnostic Christ, who literally comes down out of the cosmos of one essence with God. The human, non-pre-existent Jesus of the Synoptics is also to be found in John, presented in a different light for complex, polemical, and evangelistic reasons. And in the end, the Jesus of the fourth gospel is not the spiritual being with which both Gnosticism and orthodoxy need him to be. Again, the Gnostic Jesus is the orthodox Jesus. And in the end, only the biblical Unitarian interpretation can explain John's Christology in light of John's multi-front polemic, and thus it emerges as the superior reading. And ultimately, I think there are few matters of more importance for the Christian today than recognizing the right Jesus in John. The evangelist was deeply concerned with those who had exchanged Jesus for a Gnostic mystery. The divine and consubstantial Savior of Gnosticism was not to be confused with the human Jesus, the Jewish Jesus of apostolic revelation. Anything short of John's Jesus was and is Antichrist, a replacement. So I believe that the study of John in the world of early Gnosticism will prove increasingly worthy of both our attention and concern as Christians who are endeavoring to carry on that great work of John, his defense of the faith once delivered to the saints against the encroaching rudiments of this world. Thank you.